At the end of 2019, most of the nations of the world have begun to cut emissions. China is the only significant source which has not. India is next, but a very long way behind China. A few other very small countries continue to increase emissions, but if China were to stop increasing fossil fuel use, the global rate of emissions would drop. 2020 poses multiple challenges to those of us who watch emissions closely. The most important change is not actually the virus and the lockdowns. Rather, it is that 2020 seems to be the first year that the radical drop in cost for utility-scale wind and solar generation has seen a response in new construction rates. US construction of wind is double previous years, while US solar is 50% more than previous years. Global data is not available to this writer at this point, but it makes sense that the acceleration is greater worldwide than in the US. The COVID-19 lockdowns have caused a significant drop in emissions, but they do not seem to have stalled the construction of new wind and solar generation. In the US, energy efficiency is still a larger factor in emissions reductions than wind plus solar, but that may change in another year or so. Energy efficiency is a $8 billion industry which eliminates about 8% of total electricity each year, spread out over multiple years, so that the cumulative impact is to reduce total electricity consumption between 15 and 20%, and it receives little attention and less respect. The most obvious impact of efficiency's silent role is that reporting on an international scale is even less coherent than reporting on global wind and solar development. Because new wind and solar generation are substantially cheaper than fossil or nuclear generation, the economic driver behind new generation from these sources is much more powerful than the expansion of natural gas in the last 20 years in the US, where gas was occasionally slightly cheaper than coal generation from existing plants, and often construction of new plants was much cheaper. Today, almost 90% of the world's fossil and nuclear generation can be replaced with wind and solar generation that is self-funding and produces power at a substantial discount. By self-funded, I mean it requires no subsidy or mandate. Because it is always raised, I should point out that the variability of wind and solar generation is not a barrier to expansion of the resource, and storage technologies are being developed today for other reasons. Storage will be needed, but less than often suggested. It is already cheap enough to permit 100% renewables. When any large region has more than 40% of its power coming from either wind or solar, we should see the economic signals line up to produce storage for renewables. Some storage being developed today in association with solar is being used to produce higher revenue for the solar generation, which is different from making it work on the grid. 2021 will probably resolve the COVID-19 issue, or at least put it into resolution mode. 2022 will be the first year we can see a clear indication of where greenhouse gas emissions are going after the virus. China seems to be aware that fossil fuels are not the way of the future, but has not yet committed to stop expansion. It is entirely possible that other countries' reductions will outpace the few remaining countries which are still expanding. CO2 from fossil fuels is about 45% of all greenhouse gases. Methane from fossil fuels is another 15%. Ending fossil fuel use is not ending all greenhouse gases, but greenhouse gas emissions cannot be addressed meaningfully unless fossil fuels are ended. The stage is set for this to happen.